Hi, it's Mark. I want to talk today about three things that all connect. They connect for me. They may or may not connect for you. It begins with a story, begins with some background, begins with some famous words by someone, and also the concept of whether or not we make an impression or make a difference. I'm of the general belief that those of us who mouth words, say things, create slogans, advertise and market ourselves, are trying to make an impression, but we don't always make a difference. And that it's actions rather than words that make the difference. Except, of course, when the words are great words of literature or great words of inspiration. Probably one of the greatest speeches or talks ever given was given by Abraham Lincoln. The Gettysburg Address, as it's known, and the Gettysburg Address is not an address of a street, but it's a speech that was given. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that speech and some of the magic of that speech beyond its message that had a huge impression on a country and probably ended the Civil War and ensured Lincoln's reelection, which was cut short by an assassination. His term was cut short by an assassination. But the 272 words of Lincoln's address that began 20 years ago. And I'm not going to read it. If you aren't familiar with it, just Google Gettysburg Address. You'll find the only controversy about it was whether it was really 272 words or 273 words. And did he write it on the train that day in his own hand, which is often rumored, and you find a lot of things about that on the internet. But no, he didn't. He wrote it in advance. He traveled the day before from Washington to Gettysburg, which isn't that far of a trip today by car. It's a couple of hours, but it's a train ride. And he overnighted with the mayor of the town of Gettysburg that night before he gave his speech. I've loved the magic of 272, that you can say that much and have that strong a message and that strong an impression and make a difference to how people behave because of your words in 272 words is daunting for a writer. So when I write, I try to make my daily columns 272 words or less. Some days I ramble on for 300 or 400 or 500 words, sometimes 1,000 words. But my daily column generally it's 272 words, or it's half that, 136, or it's half of that, 68, or half of that, 34, or some combination thereof. I have this affinity for the 272. It's magical for me. And I had an occasion to go to Gettysburg. So that begins my story of a trip to Washington, D.C. several years ago. I registered for a Toastmasters convention in Washington, D.C., not so much because I wanted to go to an annual convention of fellow Toastmasters, which is fun, good speakers to hear and hang out with, but it was a trip to Washington, and I'd never been there before. I stayed in Arlington, just across the river from Washington, D.C., just above where the Arlington Cemetery is and not far from where the Pentagon is. So I got to be tourist and go see those shrines to American military and history. Went to the Eternal Flame at JFK's grave, and I journeyed down the road to McLean, Virginia, and Langley, drove to where CIA headquarters was. I mean, I'm curious about all these things that we read about and hear about, but never go see. And then, of course, I spent 5 days in Washington as mostly tourist and saw a lot of sights. And that's an entire talk of many hours length for another day. Well, let's focus on Lincoln and Gettysburg. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. It's not far from Arlington, about a 2-hour drive. Upstate, I think is the correct term. I went upstate in Virginia and found my way into Pennsylvania and journeyed to Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is the site of a major battle in the American Civil War, where over 50,000 soldiers lost their lives in that battle. It wasn't a one-day battle, but over a short period of time in what would today, I think, be measured by about 50 square miles in and around the town of Gettysburg. And when you go there as a tourist, you can take a drive around the battlefield. And there are all kinds of monuments to soldiers. Some are statues and some are statues of a horse with a soldier on it. And there are plaques at all of these touch points along the route. So it's an important part of the economy of Gettysburg that there are tourists who come and go there. And there's the site of the cemetery. There's I guess, gift shop / interpretive center. It's run by the United States Park Service, and they have people there to help you and give you pamphlets and explain things, and you can buy souvenirs. And I was chatting with one of these fellows, and I said, I'm really curious to know exactly where Lincoln stood. I want to know exactly where he was giving this speech. Because you go out there today, and there's the massive cemetery that is the Gettysburg Military Cemetery. The purpose of the Gettysburg Address was to consecrate, I think, or dedicate that cemetery. It was opened, and there were people there to hear the speeches. The location of where all the graves are and all the grave markers has at its, I guess, its side a monument to the Gettysburg Address and to Lincoln. And it's almost like a platform that you would stand there to give a speech to people who would be standing out there. But of course, that seems nonsensical, because there would have been this freshly created large cemetery with 50,000 graves and all these markers. They wouldn't have people standing on the graves to listen to a speech. And the fellow there confirmed that to me, that if I turned the opposite way on the adjacent land, which is a civilian cemetery today, but in those days, it was just a field. So that's where the platform was. That's where the people stood. So they weren't standing on the graves, which would have been disrespectful and probably pretty muddy too. In any case, Lincoln was invited to give some remarks at that ceremony. He was invited to be the last speaker, and he was invited to be brief. The great orator of the day, a fellow named Smith, was on that stage for over 2 hours, giving a speech to the crowd. And of course, the crowd were well-wishers, they were interested people, and they were news media people. In those days, there were no telephones, no cell phones. There was the telegraph. So one of the advantages to the message to Lincoln to be brief was that he could have a brief enough text that the journalists could telegraph the text of the speech to Los Angeles, to New York, to Boston, to the various major cities that had major newspapers, so it could be printed the following day. So this was part politics. It was part comfort for people who were coming to grips with the fact that there was war on, and all these soldiers had sacrificed their lives. And it was, history has proven his message did make a difference that day. It was about nation building, and it was about the deeming slavery obsolete, the Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln, and later civil rights legislation that flowed from those actions were very important in the history of the United States. They were also the key issue in the Civil War, which went on after Gettysburg. But the Gettysburg victory, if you can call the loss of 50,000 lives victory, but the victory of the Union Army, the North, defeating the South, it was a very pivotal battle in the history of the Civil War. And if you research or read about the Civil War, it was a real turning point. It was a turning point from where the war was almost lost, because the Union Army wasn't doing as well at that point, but it was a turning point in the war. I got to find where Lincoln actually stood to give his very powerful speech, a nation-building speech, and a speech that a long time after is still revered as one of the greatest speeches ever given. So, did his words make an impression? Of course they did. Did they make a difference? I think history bears out that they did. But most words that we have don't make a difference. I went to that convention. I heard a lot of wonderful speeches, and they were mostly forgotten shortly after they were given, because that's what happens when we talk, right? Whether we talk to an audience of one or an audience of an assembled group at a cemetery dedication, or we talk to hundreds or thousands in a room, or we talk to huge multitudes electronically. It's just words, 26 letters and 9 characters of punctuation. It's words. We can make an impression. Or do we really want to make a difference? For me, the message of Gettysburg, the speech, Lincoln, an appreciation of the history of that time, and the fact that he was pasted on at the end of a long program where people have been standing there without chairs for a long time listening to speeches. He had to be brief, and 272 words of magic, of literature, of politics, of power. We all need to say less and mean more. We all need to say things carefully, not just for a headline or a soundbite or to get something trending, hashtag my powerful words, but rather we need to think about what we say, think about what we write. And are we making a difference? Do we have a message that's important? So when wrapping up, what is my message? Well, obviously, go to Washington, D.C. or any other great place with a lot of history and be a great tourist. I'd love to go back to Washington, D.C. because I've been to Congress, I've been to the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court, the Canadian Embassy, where I met and interviewed Alberta's representative in Washington. I went to the Newseum, which is a museum about news that's right next door to the Canadian Embassy on Pennsylvania Avenue. But I haven't been to the White House, and I haven't been to any of those 18 museums called the Smithsonian. I thought, there's so many of them, I don't know where to start. I'll save that for another day. Ladies and gentlemen, my audience of 1 or 101, I've talked far more than 272 words in this talk, obviously. But I want to draw your attention to the magic of 272, the magic of Lincoln's words, and the Gettysburg Address, long regarded as one of the greatest speeches ever given, and it is well worth a read. I'm wrapping up for now. I'm Mark Kolke. Have a great day. Bye for now.